Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, the 10 books that made me. But before I get to the books, just give me 1 minute to talk about today's sponsor. And that sponsor is Serious Readers, who sent me one of their HD reading lights to try out. And it is fantastic. I've been hugely impressed by this. It uses something they call daylight wave technology. And it really is like reading in daylight. So even though I sit by a window when I'm reading, I found that I sometimes use this during the day. If it's a bit cloudy outside or something like that, I turn the light on and it's like having sun on the page. It's really bright, really effective, and really does make reading easier. And the thing that's impressed me hugely about this light is just the attention to detail on everything. It's really nicely designed, very well constructed. Even the packaging was fantastic. It comes with very clear personalised instructions and it's extremely easy to get set up, even for someone like me. It really is an excellent reading light and I found it a joy to use. If you're in the market for a reading light, do check out their website. I'll leave a link in the description to the video and you can use the code OLLIE24 to get £100 off your first order. So today's video is 51 years in the making. These are the 10 books that I think have had the greatest influence on me as a reader. And all of these books I would say I read in the first kind of 20 years or so of my life. But they're the books that I think have had the greatest influence on my reading tastes. I have cheated a tiny bit in that some of these aren't technically books. There's at least one comic in here, but you get the idea. These are the things that I read that really shaped my reading. So without further ado, let me get on with the list. So the first book in the list is We Didn't Mean to Go to Sea by Arthur Ransome. So this is a book I read as a kid and I will be going through this list chronologically. So this is from a series of books called the Swallows and Amazons books and I loved those books as a kid. So the first book, Swallows and Amazons, is about this group of siblings who go away on holiday to the lakes in the UK and just have fun sailing. They meet a pair of sisters there and have like battles with them and things like that. So just really fun kind of kids getting away from their parents and enjoying themselves. And there's a whole series of books and many of them are similar. They're kind of fairly like low risk kind of books, I guess. They're quite cosy, they're just enjoyable. The thing that's great about We Didn't Mean to Go to Sea is there's real peril in this book. So as the title suggests, in this book they're out in one of their boats and they get swept out to sea. And it's about them trying to survive and get back. And I remember it making a real impression on me as a kid. Just that sense of adventure, that sense of fighting against the elements, that sense of, needing to pull together to survive really, really spoke to me and I really enjoyed it. And it's a theme that I've continued to enjoy in books since then. The second book is a bit of a cheat because it is kind of a series of books. And I certainly haven't read all of these books by any means because there are loads of them. But it's the Doctor Who books. So I read a fair few of these as a kid. In particular, I remember really enjoying Doctor Who and the Dinosaur Invasion because I was really into dinosaurs as a kid. Who isn't? So these are a series of books based off the Doctor Who TV series in the UK. I was reading them, probably in the early 80s. And just thoroughly enjoyed them. And I think the thing I have taken away from these books and continue to enjoy as an adult is the pleasure of reading things that are not books translated into books, if that makes sense. So these are novelizations of a TV show. Around the same time, I was reading lots of novelizations of movies, and there was that sense of being able to experience things that I couldn't experience otherwise through a book. So, with movies in particular, this was back in the days before, before VHS, or maybe there was VHS around, but we certainly didn't have a video player, where a movie came out at the cinema, and if you didn't see it in the few weeks it was at the cinema, you wouldn't see it until 4 years later when it was on TV. So things like Star Wars, I first experienced as a book. And, similarly with Doctor Who, I would be able to watch Doctor Who on TV, watch whatever episode was on that week, but I couldn't watch some of the classic episodes from the past, but I could experience them through books. And that's something that I've, continued to enjoy as an adult, is because I think because I love reading so much, that sometimes, even when something wasn't originally a book, with a movie or a video game or whatever, I can get real pleasure from reading about that subject, reading about those characters. Okay, the next one is kind of a series, but let me talk mostly about the first book. And that book is Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings. So the first book in the Belgariad series. There was a subsequent series called the Malloreon, and I think there were some standalone books in the series as well. So a kind of epic fantasy type story. The thing that I've said on the channel before, I'm not a huge fan of fantasy. As a kid, I did really enjoy fantasy, but particularly this series. I thought this series was fantastic. So it tells the story of a young boy, Garion, who lives a fairly sheltered life, lives on a farm with his aunt, and everything gets turned upside down one day. They have to flee the farm, and he meets this group of other characters, and as the story progresses, they go on this kind of grander and grander adventure. The thing I love about this book, or loved about this book at the time, and still love about this book, the thing I really took from it as a reader was the characters. There's a really rich range of different characters in this book. They're all, looking back on it, they're probably all quite cliched, but I really enjoyed all of the different characters. They all have very distinctive characteristics. They're all very different from each other. Garion as the young boy is the character I related to the most. But there's a guy who's like a Viking type character who's like really tough. There's a guy who's like a kind of charming thief type character. And I really, really enjoyed that mix of characters and just hanging out with them, spending time with this group of characters. And it really taught me, I think, as a reader, the importance of good characters to a book. Next up, we have another one that's a complete cheat, and that is the comic 2000 AD. So I was a huge fan of 2000 AD as a kid. It's a long-running British comic book, still running, started in the 70s, I think, still running today. And each week you get, so it comes out weekly, and each week you get like 4 or 5 or 6 different stories. They tend to be like ongoing stories about different characters. So, you have to buy it every week to read the instalment. There were 3 long-running comic strips within 2000 AD that I remember really speaking to me as a kid. So one is the one that's most famous, Judge Dredd. The second one is Nemesis the Warlock, and then the third one is The Ballad of Halo Jones. So Judge Dredd is a really tough kind of lawman, police officer in a terribly dystopian future city who just goes around fighting crime, being tough. But the thing that it has, and the thing that I think a lot of the stories in 2000 AD have, is a kind of cynicism, a kind of an kind of edge of politics. So you are reading an adventure story, but there's always some sense of a kind of political edge to it. The movie that most reminds me of Judge Dredd is not either of the Judge Dredd films, it's RoboCop. So RoboCop has that same sense of being an enjoyable, gritty, brutal, kind of sci-fi adventure, but also throughout it having politics. That's definitely true of Judge Dredd as well. And it's also true, I think even more true, of Nemesis the Warlock. So Nemesis is this non-human, alien character who is fighting this terrible, fascist overlord called Torquemada, who is rules a kind of galactic empire. And Nemesis is a freedom fighter going up against him. And I really enjoyed that sense of, kind of the fight against fascism and oppression. Really, really enjoyed the politics of that. And then Halo Jones is a gentler story than either of those two, just about this kind of young woman in space, basically doing different things, meeting different characters. So it's quite an inclusive kind of story, I think. So a different kind of politics, but still has politics within it. So yeah, those 3 strips in particular I really, really enjoyed from 2000 AD. And I think they shaped my tastes in terms of always enjoying stuff which is first and foremost popular entertainment, but that has something, a little something to say in terms of politics and a world view as well. Okay, next up we have not an individual story or book, but an author, H.P. Lovecraft. So I first read H.P. Lovecraft, I think when I was about 11. I started at a new school and made friends with a kid who was really into horror, and he recommended Lovecraft to me. And I read, I think the first thing I read by Lovecraft was probably The Rats in the Walls, or it might have been Pickman's Model. But just remember being blown away by the kind of macabre invention and imagination that Lovecraft had. And it was my introduction to horror, and clearly, my love of the horror genre has continued since then. So I think that's what Lovecraft, brought to my reading life, was the appreciation of dark stuff, the appreciation of being creeped out and scared, and the appreciation of the kind of imagination, the kind of weird imagination that can conjure up that kind of thing. And that's something I've continued to enjoy since then. Okay, next up, we have Deadline at Dawn by Cornell Woolrich. So this is a book I found completely by chance in the library. I was a frequent visitor to my local library, and I found this on one of the spinner racks, and it just looked cool. And part of the reason it looked cool was, I think, that it was an American paperback. It was an American edition of the paperback. I don't know why my library had it, to be honest with you. But they actually had a few different Cornell Woolrich books, and I read a few of them as a young teenager. This is a suspense novel, I think from the 40s, about a couple going through like a huge amount of disruption. These two young people who kind of come together in this book, and it takes place over the course of one night. And I can't remember now, I should have checked before, I can't remember what the overarching story is, if there's a murder involved or something like that. I suspect there might be. But it's about the two of them just trying to survive this night and kind of coming together as a couple. And it was just my introduction to suspense, to not adventure, not horror, not, kind of action and stuff like that, but just suspense, that continued, that continued tension of not knowing what is going to happen and rooting for these characters and wanting them to survive. And it's just a fantastically enjoyable, kind of dark noirish story. And I've continued to enjoy stories like that ever since. Okay, next up we have one of the big ones, and an author you probably expected to see on this list. This is Stephen King. So the book I want to talk about is The Shining. This wasn't the first book I read by King. The first Stephen King book I read was Christine. But I think I read The Shining fairly soon afterwards. It was probably one of the first 3 or 4 King books I read. And the thing that impressed me then, and it continues to impress me about The Shining, is the way it just pulls a lot of the things I've just talked about together into one book, and it just feels like a perfectly formed novel to me. So you've got really interesting characters who you root for. You've got a deep sense of creepiness and kind of creeping horror. You've got a bit of kind of, a bit of politics and kind of thoughtfulness, particularly around Jack's character, around his alcoholism and things like that. So there's the sense of something a bit more in that book, and you've got like absolute suspense. I still think it's a fantastic book. It's still, I think, my favourite Stephen King book, and a book that really cemented my love of King. So I'd enjoyed the stuff I read up until The Shining, but The Shining is the one that really stuck with me as, boy, I need to read everything this guy ever writes, and blessedly he has continued to write great books to this day. Okay, next we have something completely different. I think the way I came to this book was through music. So I was in my teens a big fan of the band The Velvet Underground, and continue to be a fan of the Velvet Underground to this day. And there's a reference in one of their songs, I can't remember which one it is, it might be White Light, White Heat, or maybe it's I'm Waiting for the Man. Anyway, there was a reference to William Burroughs. And there was a guy I used to get the train to school with, who was, I think, a year or so older than me, who I thought was really, really cool. He was really into the Velvet Underground as well. And he told me about William Burroughs, and particularly about William Burroughs's cut-up style of writing, where he'd literally write a page of stuff and then cut it up and put the words back together and form something different, and that would be what ended up getting published. So the first book I read by Burroughs was called just a William Burroughs Reader, which just had bits from different things he'd written. The book that really, really made the impression on me was Naked Lunch. And part of the reason for, the thing I've taken away from that book as a reader, I guess, is an interest, not necessarily a love, but an interest in experimental styles of writing. So you'll know, if you've watched this channel, that the books I tend to read tend to be quite straightforward in terms of their prose. I enjoy that kind of straightforward style of writing. But I also am interested in, don't always enjoy, but I'm interested in experimental writing. So that was one of the things that it took away from that I took away from Naked Lunch. The other thing is just an appreciation of disturbing fiction. There's some horrific stuff in Naked Lunch, and I found it absolutely fascinating. And I read Naked Lunch far too young. I think it was probably 12 or 13. But I was just blown away by the sheer horribleness of it, and the fact that I could get through that horribleness, the disturbing sequences in that book, of which there are many, they stuck with me, but I was able to get through them. And I think that is something that I've I've continued to enjoy as a reader within the horror genre, but also outside the horror genre, is reading stuff that really challenges you in that way, that makes you face up to the darkness in the world and gets you through it. Okay, next up then, so we have 2 books left. So the next book is something completely different from Naked Lunch, and that's a book called The Delinquents by an Australian author called Criena Rohan. I thought this was a fantastic book. So this was written, I think, in the 50s or 60s, and it's a romance. And Criena Rohan's premise for the book was, what if Romeo and Juliet were like juvenile delinquents in the modern world? And that's what it's about. It's about 2 young people in Sydney, I think, or maybe Melbourne, I think it's Sydney though, in Australia, who fall in love, and just about the trials and tribulations as they try and survive. So they're both very poor. They live in a kind of rundown area of the town, and it's just about their relationship and about them trying to survive. And for me, it was a different kind of book than anything I'd read before. I hadn't read romance before, really. Well, I hadn't read romance before. I tended to read, genre fiction, horror, sci-fi, that kind of thing. But yeah, the Delinquents really spoke to me. I really got into this couple's relationship, and I found it fascinating, I suppose. Reading about people who are around my age, but also just reading a different kind of book. And whilst I still tend to read genre fiction, it did open up an appreciation for other kinds of books to me as well. So that was definitely an important book for me, even though it's not the kind of thing I typically read today. And then the final book is Unknown Man number 89 by Elmore Leonard. So I found this in a charity shop. I used to go around the town I lived in, on a Saturday morning, just do a round of all the charity shops and see what I could find. And I found this one. This was after I'd read Deadline at Dawn, so I already knew I was kind of intrigued by the crime genre. But I hadn't read any modern crime. So this was the first, I think probably the first modern crime book I read. And I was blown away by it. Really, really enjoyed it. And what is distinctive of Elmore Leonard's work, and that I continue to enjoy to this day, is having a group of just interesting characters to read about. And his books are definitely more character-based than they are, kind of plot-based, which is unusual for crime fiction. So you've got that, but most of all, the dialogue. The dialogue in Elmore Leonard's books is just so natural, so fantastic. And it was one of the first times I was really impressed, purely by the dialogue in a book. I think I'd never really thought about it as an element of writing before. I was much more focused on, kind of the story until that point. But Elmore Leonard taught me to really appreciate that kind of punchy style of dialogue that you get in American crime fiction. It's something I continue to love to this day. So there you have it, the 10 books that made me the reader I am today. I'll be really interested to hear in the comments what some of your picks would be for your 10 books. And if you've got a YouTube channel and you fancy doing this, I'd love to see it. Anyway, I'll leave it there and say, as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.